In ancient Persia, a condemned man could be trapped between two boats, covered in milk and honey, and left in a stagnant marsh while insects gathered around him. Ancient writers called it Scaphism. Modern historians question how literally the surviving account should be read. But that uncertainty is part of the story because historical punishment sits in a strange zone where documented law, eyewitness testimony, political propaganda, and later invention often overlap. This list contains 50 punishments and punishment legends from across history. Some are securely documented in court records and legal codes. Some survive through hostile or much later sources. A few famous examples were probably never used at all. When the evidence is weak, it stays weak. The goal is not to make the past look more monstrous than it was. It does not need the help. What connects these cases is not only pain, it is design. Authorities selected materials, procedures, audiences, symbols, and durations. A punishment could silence a mouth, mark a hand, turn a ship into an executioner, or erase a person's name. The body was not only hurt, it was made to communicate. 1. Scaphism. Ancient Greek writer Plutarch attributed Scaphism to the Persian court. The condemned was reportedly restrained between two hollowed boats with the head, hands, and feet exposed. Milk and honey were forced into the body and smeared across the skin before the boats were left in heat and standing water. Insects gathered, infection followed, and death was said to take days. No Persian record confirms the procedure, and many scholars treat Plutarch's description cautiously, but the story survived because its logic is so disturbing. The executioner does almost nothing after setting the conditions. Heat, waste, insects, and time perform the sentence. 2. The Brazen Bull. Ancient sources describe a hollow bronze bull supposedly made for Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragos in Sicily. A victim was locked inside while a fire heated the metal from below. Tubes in the head were said to transform screams into the sound of a bellowing animal. The inventor, Perillos, was allegedly the first person forced inside. The device may belong partly or entirely to political legend. Cruel rulers often attracted theatrical stories after their deaths. Real or embellished, the image reveals what ancient audiences feared. Not merely execution, but a machine built to turn suffering into entertainment. 3. Boiling alive. In 1531, during the reign of Henry VIII, the English Parliament made poisoning a form of high treason, punishable by boiling. Richard Roos, a cook accused of poisoning members of a bishop's household, was lowered into a cauldron at Smithfield before a public crowd. The law was short-lived, but the symbolism was deliberate. Poisoning was imagined as a secret crime committed through food, so the punishment used a cooking vessel in public. The state answered hidden contamination with visible heat. 4. Molten metal. Down the throat. Medieval and early modern stories describe counterfeiters or corrupt officials being killed by having molten metal poured into the mouth. The moral design is almost too perfect. A person who abused coinage or precious metal was destroyed by the same substance in liquid form. Documentation varies sharply by place and case, and later retellings often present symbolic punishments as if they were routine law. Even so, the recurring image matters. Pre-modern justice frequently tried to make the sentence resemble the offense, turning execution into a brutal visual metaphor. 5. Branding. Branding pressed a heated mark into the skin so that punishment continued long after the wound closed. English courts used letters and other marks in different periods to identify certain offenders, while military, colonial, and slave systems used branding for ownership, desertion, or criminal status. Before centralized records could follow a person from town to town, the body could become the record. A scar did not lose paperwork. It affected work, travel, marriage, and every attempt to begin again. The sentence ended in court. The label remained visible. 6. The Scottish boot. The boot enclosed the lower leg in wood or metal. Wedges were hammered between the frame and the shin, increasing pressure until tissue and bone were crushed. Variants appeared in Scotland and continental Europe, especially in interrogations connected to political or religious conflict. Its cruelty came from calibration. The interrogator could add one wedge, pause, ask another question, then continue. Pain became an adjustable instrument rather than a single blow. 7. The rack. The rack stretched a prisoner across a frame while ropes attached to the wrists and ankles were tightened by rollers. Joints could dislocate, muscles could tear, and the threat of another turn often mattered as much as the damage already done. The Tower of London kept a rack, and its use is documented in several Tudor interrogations. The machine gave authority a visual advantage. Everyone in the room could see exactly how much farther the body might be pulled. 8. Strappado tied the hands behind the back and hoisted the prisoner by the wrists. The body's full weight pulled the shoulders backward, often causing dislocation. Some versions added weights to the feet or repeatedly dropped and stopped the victim. Unlike a complex machine, Strappado required little more than rope, height, and gravity. That made it portable, repeatable, and easy to use in prisons, military settings, and inquisitorial interrogations. 9. The Judas Cradle. The so-called Judas Cradle is usually described as a pointed wooden pyramid onto which a restrained prisoner was lowered. Body weight concentrated pressure on a small area, while ropes allowed the operator to control the descent. The problem is evidence. Modern museums and internet lists often present the device with more certainty than surviving records justify. It may reflect real families of suspension and pressure torture, but its standardized name and form are difficult to document. The honest version is still disturbing. The legend may be newer than the cruelty it represents. 10. The Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey, or wooden horse, placed a person astride a narrow ridge, sometimes with weights attached to the legs. Versions of the wooden horse are documented as military and disciplinary punishments, although the most extreme descriptions are often repeated without reliable sourcing. Its principle was brutally simple. The device did not strike the body, it forced the body to injure itself through weight, balance, and time. The first 10 punishments relied on heat, leverage, pressure, and gravity. The next group removed even more responsibility from the human executioner. Animals, or their instincts, became part of the mechanism. 11. Poena culae, the penalty of the sack. Roman law associated parricide with poena culae, the penalty of the sack. The condemned was sewn into a leather bag and thrown into water. Later legal descriptions famously include a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey inside the sack, although the exact combination changed across periods and may not have been used consistently. The ritual treated killing a parent as a crime against nature itself. The offender was denied ordinary contact with earth, air, water, and burial, then sealed with animals chosen for symbolic disorder. 12. Damnatio ad bestias. Damnatio ad bestias condemned people to wild animals in Roman arenas. Victims could be tied to posts, dressed as mythological characters, or left exposed while lions, bears, leopards, and other animals were released before a crowd. This was punishment, spectacle, and imperial propaganda at the same time. Rome displayed control over criminals, prisoners, enslaved people, and animals imported from distant territories. Even the elevators that lifted cages into the arena turned cruelty into engineering. 13. Execution by elephant. Across parts of South and Southeast Asia, rulers used trained elephants to execute or mutilate prisoners. Accounts describe animals crushing a head quickly, breaking limbs one by one, or holding a victim in place while the sentence was announced. The elephant was not merely a large weapon, it was trained, controlled, and publicly associated with royal power. The ruler could demonstrate both mercy and terror by commanding the same animal either to stop or to finish. 14. Rat torture. A recurring torture method places live rats beneath an inverted container on a prisoner's body. Heat applied to the container drives the animals away from the hot metal and toward the only softer route available. Versions appear in historical accounts, prison stories, and later political testimony, though individual claims are often difficult to verify. Its design weaponizes panic. The torturer creates an environment, then allows the animal's survival instinct to do the physical work. 15. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is said to have restrained a prisoner above young bamboo shoots, so that rapid growth slowly pressed into the body. Bamboo can grow extraordinarily fast, and post-war demonstrations showed that shoots can penetrate soft material. The historical record is much thinner than the biological claim. Most stories are linked to the Pacific theater of the Second World War and lack independent documentation. It belongs on this list not as proven routine, but as a warning. A plausible mechanism can make an uncertain story feel automatically true. Animals made punishment appear natural, as if the state had only released forces that already existed. But many legal systems wanted the opposite effect. They wanted the body to remain visible as a message long after the moment of pain. 16. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. For high treason in England, a man could be dragged to the execution site, hanged, cut down, disemboweled, beheaded, and divided into quarters. Practice varied, and some condemned men were dead before the later stages, but the legal sentence was real and remained formally available until the 19th century. Treason was imagined as an attack on the body of the kingdom. The answer was written onto the body of the traitor, whose remains could be displayed in different locations so that the warning traveled farther than the execution itself. 17. Lingxi was a real capital punishment in Imperial China, abolished in 1905. It involved cutting and dismemberment and was reserved for offenses regarded as especially grave, including certain forms of treason and severe family crimes. Western descriptions often inflate the number of cuts, the duration, and the ritual detail. Photographs circulated without context and were used to portray China as uniquely cruel. The careful version is enough. Lingxi attacked life, bodily wholeness, dignity, and memory. It does not need the mythology added later. 18. Flaying, removing skin from a living or recently killed person, appears in ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions, artistic depictions, and scattered accounts from other regions. Assyrian kings described it as a punishment for rebels and as a warning to conquered cities. The skin made power visible. A ruler could claim not only to defeat an enemy, but to transform the enemy's body into a permanent display of what resistance would cost. 19. Impalement. Impalement used a sharpened stake to pierce or support the body. Executioners could angle the stake to cause rapid death or, according to many accounts, avoid major organs and prolong survival. It was used in several regions, but it is most closely associated in popular memory with Vlad III of Wallachia. Chroniclers may have exaggerated the number of his victims, yet the political purpose is clear. Rows of stakes turned territory itself into a warning. An army approaching the city encountered the message before it encountered the defenders. 20. Gibbeting. Gibbeting displayed an executed body in chains or a fitted iron cage, often near a road, harbor, crossroads, or the scene of the crime. In Britain, the practice continued into the 19th century. The state used decomposition as part of the sentence. Weather, birds, smell, and time kept changing the display. While denial of ordinary burial added religious and social terror. The execution ended, the advertisement remained. 21. Crucifixion. Forms of crucifixion were used by several ancient powers, but Rome developed it into a highly visible state punishment for slaves, rebels, pirates, and people without full civic protection. The condemned could be scourged, tied, or nailed to a cross, and left to die from a combination of trauma, exposure, exhaustion, dehydration, and respiratory failure. A notice could identify the offense. Death was intentionally slow enough for travelers and crowds to understand the lesson. Crucifixion was designed to be legible. 22. Rhinotomy, cutting off the nose, appeared as punishment or political mutilation in several societies. In Byzantium, damaging a rival's face could make him seem physically unfit to rule. Justinian II was mutilated after his deposition and later returned to power, a remarkable exception to the intended logic. The sentence targeted the future rather than only the past. A person might survive, but the face would continue announcing exclusion, disgrace, or lost legitimacy. 23. Tongue boring or removal. Legal systems have punished blasphemy, perjury, slander, and rebellious speech by piercing, burning, or removing the tongue. Colonial American records include cases in which a hot iron was used against repeat offenders for religious speech crimes. The symbolism was literal. The organ associated with the offense became the object of punishment. Authority did not merely reject the words, it tried to redesign who was physically able to speak. By this point, the body has become a document. But a punishment did not need to destroy flesh to control a community. Sometimes a crowd, a costume, or the removal of legal protection could do the work more cheaply. 24. The Scold's Bridle. The Scold's Bridle, or brank, was an iron framework locked around the head. Some examples included a plate or bit that pressed against the tongue. It was used especially in Scotland and northern England against women accused of scolding, quarreling, drunkenness, or disruptive speech. The device combined pain, silence, and public display. A person could be led through town wearing the accusation on her face. Speech was answered with hardware. 25. The Drunkard's cloak accounts from early modern England and Europe describe offenders forced to wear a barrel with holes for the head and arms. The punishment is often associated with drunkenness and sometimes called the Newcastle cloak. Evidence is thinner than for major court sentences, so it should not be treated as universal practice. But its design fits the period perfectly. Turn the offender into the container associated with the offense, then let the street complete the humiliation. 26. The Pillory. The pillory locked the head and hands into a wooden frame in a public place. That sounds mild until the victim is unable to protect the face while a crowd throws food, mud, stones, bricks, or dead animals. Some people were mutilated as part of the sentence. Others were seriously injured or killed by the crowd. The mechanism outsourced violence. Authorities supplied immobilization and permission. The public supplied whatever came next. 27. The ducking stool. A ducking stool strapped a person, usually a woman accused of scolding or disorder, into a chair attached to a beam and repeatedly lowered into water. Terminology and construction varied, and the related cucking stool was not always the same device. The quaint name hides the risk. Cold, dirty water, panic, restrained movement, and repeated immersion could turn theatrical humiliation into hypothermia, injury, or drowning. 28. Tearing and feathering. Tearing and feathering was usually mob punishment rather than a formal judicial sentence. Heated tar or pitch was spread over the body, feathers were applied, and the victim was paraded, expelled, or exposed to further attack. It became especially associated with political conflict in Britain and colonial America. Language makes it sound almost comic. That was part of its power. By turning a person into a ridiculous costume, a crowd could disguise violence as public humor. 29. The shame flute. The shame flute is displayed in museums as an iron device shaped like a musical instrument, supposedly fastened around the neck and fingers of bad musicians. It appears frequently in lists of medieval punishments. Its actual historical use is uncertain, and some surviving objects may have been misidentified or embellished for later audiences. Like the Judas cradle, it shows how easily a visually perfect object can become accepted history when the documentation is much less impressive than the exhibit. 30. Outlawry. Outlawry sounds less violent than a wheel or a blade, but it attacked the legal protection that made ordinary life possible. In medieval English law, an outlaw could lose property, standing, access to courts, and protection against violence, depending on the period and type of proceeding. The law did not always need to build a device. It could simply withdraw recognition. For a social species, being pushed outside the agreement that restrains strangers can become a slow death sentence. 30 punishments in, the pattern is clearer. The most disturbing cases are not always the most painful. They are the ones with a procedure, materials, sequence, audience, and timing. Pain was the tool. The product was obedience. The next group used time, confinement, and the environment as executioners. 31. Keel hauling. Keel hauling tied a sailor to a rope, threw him overboard, and dragged him beneath or along the hull of a ship. It is documented as a rare official punishment in some naval contexts, especially in the Dutch Navy, though pirate stories often exaggerate its frequency. The danger included drowning, impact, and cuts from a rough or fouled hull. Its symbolism was exact. The ship, workplace, prison, home, and only protection from the sea became the instrument of punishment. 32. Immurement. Immurement means enclosing a person inside a wall, chamber, or sealed space. Stories of live entombment appear in folk folklore, religious legend, and some historical punishment accounts, but individual cases are often difficult to separate from later storytelling. Elizabeth Bathory is frequently described as being walled into her castle. The more cautious account is that she was confined in rooms under guard until her death, not necessarily sealed into a literal wall. The distinction matters. Confinement was real. The most theatrical version may not be. 33. The oubliette. The word oubliette comes from the French verb meaning to forget. Popular descriptions present it as a deep dungeon, entered only through a ceiling hatch, where a prisoner could be lowered and abandoned. Some castles contain chambers that fit the image, but many supposed oubliettes were probably storage spaces, cisterns, or latrines. Purpose-built forgotten dungeons were likely less common than tourism suggests. The legend survives because disappearance can feel more frightening than execution. No ceremony, no witness, only absence. 34. Pressing. Peine forte dure. Under English law, a defendant who refused to enter a plea could be subjected to peine forte dure. Heavy weights were placed on the body until the person pleaded or died. The procedure was intended to force the court process forward. For some defendants, silence was a terrible legal strategy. A conviction could lead to forfeiture, while dying without a plea might preserve property for heirs. Giles Corey endured pressing during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Tradition records his final demand as more weight. Cruelty was attached directly to paperwork. 35. The burial of a Vestal virgin. Roman Vestal virgins were sacred priestesses expected to maintain chastity. A Vestal convicted of breaking the vow could be carried to an underground chamber with small provisions and sealed inside. The ritual allowed Rome to claim it had not directly shed sacred blood. The state created the conditions for death, then hid the action inside legal and religious language. She was not officially. She was placed somewhere from which survival was impossible. 36. Sawing is described in accounts and images from several regions. A condemned person suspended upside down and cut through the body, often beginning between the legs. The inverted position was said to keep blood flowing to the brain and prolong consciousness. Documentation is uneven, and later torture literature tends to merge separate traditions into one standardized method. Still, the image captures a recurring principle of exemplary punishment. Execution was made slower and more visible so that the procedure, not merely the death, became the warning. Confinement punished one body at a time. States and armies faced a different problem: how to control thousands of people who carried weapons, worked in groups, and could turn against authority. Their solution was to make the group participate. 37. Roman decimation. Roman decimation punished collective cowardice, mutiny, or failure. Soldiers were divided into groups, lots were drawn, and roughly 1 in 10 was selected to die at the hands of his comrades. Survivors could receive reduced rations or be forced to camp outside the main defenses. The selection did not need to identify the worst soldier. Randomness was the point. Decimation translated terror into arithmetic, simple enough for every legionary to remember. Failure could make the group kill one of its own. 38. Breaking on the wheel. The breaking wheel shattered the limbs of a condemned person with a wheel, hammer, or iron bar. The broken body could then be woven through the spokes and raised for public display. Procedures differed by region, and a quicker death might be granted as an act of mercy. The punishment survived in parts of Europe far beyond the period casually called medieval. It first destroyed the body's structure, then transformed that structure into a sign. 39. The garrote. The garrote fixed the condemned against a post or chair with an iron collar. A screw tightened from behind, causing strangulation, neck injury, or both. Spain used forms of the garrote into the 20th century. Salvador Puig Antique was executed by garrote in 1974. That date matters. The device looks medieval, but it belonged to the age of television, commercial aviation, and modern bureaucracy. Its quiet mechanical order made execution look less like spectacle and more like administration. 40. The cat o' nine tails. The cat o' nine tails was a whip made from multiple knotted cords. It became a standard instrument of discipline in the British Royal Navy and Armed Forces, where courts-martial could impose severe floggings. The punishment was public to the crew and carefully counted. Each stroke was both injury and instruction. On a ship where isolation and mutiny made authority fragile, the body of one sailor became a lesson delivered to everyone on deck. 41. Political blinding. Byzantine rulers used blinding to neutralize political rivals without necessarily executing them. Physical wholeness was associated with the ability to rule, command, and appear before the public, so mutilation could disqualify a claimant while leaving him alive. A Byzantine chronicler claimed that Emperor Basil II blinded thousands of Bulgarian prisoners after the Battle of Cladion, leaving guides with one eye. The number may be exaggerated, but the political logic was real. Sometimes a living warning was more useful than a martyr. 42. Prison hulks. From the late 18th into the 19th century, Britain converted old warships into floating prisons known as hulks. They held convicts near shore while authorities struggled with overcrowding, labor demands, and transportation to penal colonies. Conditions varied, but many hulks became notorious for disease, contaminated water, crowding, and death. The punishment was not a single dramatic device. It was storage. A logistical solution turned unwanted people into cargo that never sailed. At this point, it is worth stopping. Historical cruelty attracts inventions because the invented devices are often cleaner, stranger, and easier to remember than real law. 4 punishments almost everyone recognizes are far less secure than popular culture suggests. 43. The Blood Eagle. Norse sagas appear to describe a blood eagle in which ribs were cut from the spine and the lungs drawn out like wings. But the texts were written long after the events. The language is poetic and ambiguous, and scholars disagree about whether the passages describe a real execution, a literary image, or later misunderstanding. The blood eagle may be less a Viking procedure than a modern desire for Vikings to behave exactly as violently as their reputation demands. 44. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is the upright metal cabinet lined with inward-facing spikes, supposedly used to enclose and pierce a victim. It is one of the most famous medieval torture devices, and almost certainly not medieval. The best-known examples were assembled or promoted in the 19th century, sometimes from unrelated old parts for collections and Gothic exhibitions. The object tells us more about the modern market for a savage Middle Ages than about medieval courtrooms. 45. Walking the plank pirates absolutely threw people overboard, marooned captives, and used brutal shipboard discipline. But the formal ritual of forcing a prisoner to walk along a projecting plank has very little reliable historical documentation. Its fame comes largely from literature, theater, and film. The plank survived because it creates a perfect scene: a line, a crowd, the sea below, and one final step. History is often messier than good staging. 46. Chinese water torture. The familiar image is a restrained prisoner driven mad by water, dripping onto the same point of the forehead. The method is routinely labeled ancient and Chinese, but the attribution is weak. A related dripping water experiment is associated with a 15th century Italian writer, while the Chinese label appeared much later. The name added exotic mystery to a simple mechanism. Sometimes the most durable part of a punishment is not the practice, but the marketing. Those 4 myths reveal a useful rule. Sounding medieval does not make something medieval, but several punishments that sound like modern satire are firmly rooted in real institutions. 47. The penal treadmill. The prison treadmill or treadwheel was introduced in 19th century Britain as hard labor. Prisoners stepped continuously on a rotating structure, sometimes powering machinery and sometimes producing little beyond exhaustion. A day could involve hours of repetitive climbing. The modern treadmill sells health, progress, and self-improvement. Its penal ancestor converted movement into a sentence. Enormous effort, measured carefully with no destination at all. 48. Stoning. Stoning appears in ancient legal and religious traditions as a communal form of execution. A group throws stones until the condemned dies, distributing the physical act across many participants rather than assigning it to one executioner. That division is not incidental. It turns judgment into collective action while making individual responsibility difficult to isolate. No single stone has to be named as the killing blow. The crowd becomes both witness and weapon. 49. Defenestration. Defenestration means throwing someone out of a window. The word exists largely because political violence in Prague made the act historically famous. In 1419, officials were thrown from the new town hall. In 1618, imperial representatives were thrown from Prague Castle, an incident that helped ignite the 30 Years' War. A window is an ordinary architectural feature. Political conflict turned it into a verb. 50. Damnatio Memoriae. Damnatio Memoriae is a modern label for Roman practices intended to damage the public memory of a disgraced person. Names could be erased from inscriptions, portraits altered or destroyed, and official honors withdrawn. It was not one uniform sentence, and erasure was never complete. The scars often made the absence more visible. That is why it belongs at number 50. The final punishment does not crush, burn, cut, or imprison the body. It attacks the person's place in history. For an elite culture built around ancestry, monuments, and reputation, social memory could be treated as another organ the state had the power to remove. Return to the first image. A man trapped between boats while insects gather around him. Whether every detail of Scaphism happened exactly as Plutarch wrote is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the larger pattern surrounding it. These punishments required infrastructure. Someone wrote the law. Someone approved the materials. Someone built the frame, heated the iron, trained the animal, counted the strokes, prepared the public space, or decided which names should disappear from stone. Even the myths required curators, writers, and audiences willing to believe that the past had produced the perfect machine for suffering. The most frightening part is not that earlier societies contained unusually cruel people. Cruelty is not unusual. The frightening part is how often cruelty became ordinary once it was given a procedure, a budget, a moral explanation, and an audience. Pain ended. The message was designed to keep working.